Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Brady. I am here with my colleague, David Jean, senior writer. We're talking about Slync, Chris Kirchner, and the charges, the investigation. First of all, who is Chris Kirchner? Tell us a little more about him and the story you wrote back in July.
So last year, I started looking into Slync and Chris Kirchner and, how the business was operating after we started hearing that employees at the company were not being paid. And that's immediately a huge red flag
Right.
whenever you're looking at any company, because people have rents and bills to pay. But what really stuck out for us and stood out for us was basically the fact that Chris Kirchner appeared to be flying around the world on his private jet, attending Pro-Am golf tournaments. He was known for driving around his Ferrari. And then on Twitter, he was talking about the fact that he was going to be buying not one, but two English football clubs. So he was rather splashy and seemed to, have all the swagger of a good entrepreneur. But when it came down to it, and you're not paying your employees, there's some questions that started, getting raised for me. So that's when we started looking into him, and we ended up publishing a story last year in July that effectively stated that he had been misrepresenting the company's finances to the board, and that he had, pushed executives out after they'd raised concerns. And this was with the backdrop of the fact that employees weren't being paid.
So he was facing at the time probably wrongful termination suits or some type of
Yes.
legal action starting to bubble up. When did the FBI and the SEC get involved? Because we're talking right now about charges being laid, raid at the house that you reported on recently, but that's a long period in between. What actually happened after the story came out?
So after the story came out in July, a few weeks later, he was suspended and then fired as CEO. He was stripped of his chairman role as well. And then we didn't really hear much for quite a while. And as we know, the gears of the justice system turn pretty slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And then yesterday morning, I had a tip come in that the FBI was at his house in Texas, and he lives in this sprawling mansion in Westlake, outside of Dallas. And, I had a number of images sent to me from, people who were there of the FBI at his house. We had images of tow trucks taking away his Rolls Royce, taking away a Mercedes G-Class, it really...
Right.
And so we understood that the FBI was conducting a raid, and shortly after, we learned that there had been charges filed against him by the Justice Department, accusing him of wire fraud, and also the SEC, who had accused him of fraudulently selling about $67 million in securities. So there was, both agencies obviously coordinated to bring charges against him.
Let's unpack this a little bit. So let's take the SEC charges. In essence, is this that was he double selling? I mean, what I'm trying to figure out the nature of the charges, because they're different than what the wrongful termination. I mean, that was a whole other issue around payment. What is it now that he's alleged to have done? Is it Ponzi scheme type stuff?
No. So what has been alleged is that he, has committed pretty straightforward fraud, and that being that there's one episode that was detailed by the Justice Department in which they said he was telling multiple stories to different people. In one case, he sent a text message to an employee of his asking that person to wire $20 million from Slync's corporate accounts to, another account, and that money actually landed in one of his personal bank accounts. Now, when his private banker, in communications with his private banker, he said that was a distribution from his company approved by the board. And as we know, it was not approved by the board. So,
right.
That's a pretty... And then what happened following that is the Justice Department alleged that he then used that money to fund a lavish lifestyle, included the purchase of a $16 million private jet.
Well, the wheels of justice will turn as they turn, and I'm sure there's more to come. I'm curious about, let's start with Goldman Sachs and the amount of money that they backed this company with. I'm always, anytime this happens and I see a big Wall Street company that throws a lot of money at something that turns out to not quite be what it seems, were they just taken for a ride too? Were they trying to sort of ride some wave of what was popular? Because you would think Goldman Sachs would have done due diligence and perhaps questioned him or the company.
Yeah, I mean, Goldman Sachs, I believe they led a $60 million funding round into the company, which is, no small amount of money. In my earlier reporting last year, we found that actually Goldman Sachs, had a member on the board, and that the board had been informed by some employees of potential financial misconduct. So it was definitely, our reporting had showed that the board was definitely made aware of this behavior, and it could be said that there was delays in taking action or not. But we also understand that the investors ended up making employees whole after Kirchner was forced to leave the company.
So they did right by the people. I mean, how is Slync itself doing? Because in my experience, when you have something like this hanging over your head, at the very least, if it's not a game-ending event, it tends to be a transformative event for a company to reemerge.
We don't have a lot of information on how Slync has been going, but Slync did issue a statement to me yesterday, and they did say, they've been cooperating with the government investigation, but they have also, been focused on selling their product, and they mentioned that, under their new CEO, that plan appears to be, going forward.
So what is the product? What business are they in, for those who don't know?
Yeah, so Slync, was effectively founded to provide a streamlined logistics software for logistics giants. And we had major companies and who were using them, like Kuhn and Nagel, and that they're really, that was a hugely untapped market for. The logistics sector is an incredibly archaic sector, and if there's a way that you can streamline a lot of the processes with the different software they use, that seemed to be a pretty good business model, and that's why Slync was rather attractive, especially to an investor like Goldman Sachs.
Now, I know you talked about some of the red flags. I want to get back to that for a second, because you've covered a number of these, investigation scandals. I don't know if there's commonalities that you've seen, but a lot of people probably come to you with wrongful termination and I'm not being paid. Was it just the sort of the disconnect between his lifestyle and what you were hearing that really sparked something to look at this company, or were there other things that made you think something's not right here?
I think what sparked my initial interest is, putting the two things next to each other, which was he was living really large and his employees were not getting paid. So obviously, that was enough reason for me to start. But once I started digging in, I could see that there was some parallels to previous companies that I've looked into. And among them was a situation in which the CEO, that being Chris Kirchner in this particular case, was one of the only people who had access to a certain bank account, which could give a clear picture of how the company was doing financially. And there's been other companies that I've covered where an executive or a CEO will wall off that
Sam Bankman-Fried comes to mind.
That knowledge from other executives who should be aware of that. And often these processes fall apart when the CFO, for example, doesn't have access to the whole financial picture. And that is something I reported that occurred with Slync. And so it sort of snowballs from there.
Yeah, no controls in place is never a good sign. More to come. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Diane.